Good morning, everyone. We're just going to wait a couple minutes for everyone to join us. Bonjour et bienvenue à tous et à toutes. Nous sommes heureux de vous accueillir à la première session de la série Boîte et outils en sciences humaines numériques de la session d'hiver. Good morning and welcome to the first session of the winter 2021 iteration of the Data DH Toolbox series. I'm Jada Watson, coordinator of the Digital Humanities at the University of Ottawa, and I'm really excited to be hosting this series again this semester. Before we begin today, I would like to start our session with an Indigenous land affirmation. We pay respect to the Algonquin people who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their longstanding relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. Nous rendons également hommage à tous les peuples autochtones qui habitent à Ottawa, qu'ils soient de la région ou d'ailleurs au Canada. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. So we're beginning our winter session series with a popular workshop from last semester. After we hosted the Nvivo workshop in November, I had an overwhelming response on Twitter and by email with interest for learning more. So back by popular demand, today is our workshop on Nvivo with Patrick Labelle. Are the days of highlighters and handwritten annotations behind us? How can we use digital tools to capture qualitative and descriptive information from our research materials? Today's workshop will introduce basic features of Nvivo 12 for preparing, managing, and analyzing qualitative data. Patrick Labelle will cover how to import data, code various data formats, and run different types of queries. Note that for this workshop, Patrick Labelle is going to be running Nvivo 12 Plus for Windows throughout the session. And to introduce our leader today, Patrick Labelle is a research librarian here at the University of Ottawa. He supports students, faculty, and researchers in the School of Psychology, the School of Social Work, and the Faculty of Education at various stages of their research projects. Since 2012, he's been offering training on Nvivo in the context of qualitative data analysis to help researchers better exploit the software's various functionalities. I'm really excited to be rehosting this topic today. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A and I will be interjecting periodically to ask the questions on your behalf. And what I'd like to start with too today is if everyone could just introduce themselves in the chat if they're comfortable with that and letting us know where you're from. It's always fun to know where our guests are joining us from today. So without further ado, I turn it over to Patrick.
All right, thank you, Jada. As Jada mentioned, I've been showcasing or talking about Nvivo now for, when she mentioned 2012, seems like a long time ago. And so it actually is. And although the software has evolved a lot, there's still stuff that you can learn about Nvivo every time you work on a new project. So it's a pretty sophisticated piece of software that really has a lot of functionality. And I want to maybe just announce this at the very beginning of the workshop. This is just an introduction to it. It's not a workshop that will give you the whole suite of features that's available through the software. It's really just to give you the basic information to get you started on a research project with Nvivo and being able to really understand some of its features and how you can sort of ask questions from your data and hopefully being able to analyze that in a more straightforward fashion. I also want to mention that when I originally learned more about Nvivo myself, I was sent to a one-day workshop. And so you can obviously imagine that spending a full day on Nvivo, you'll learn a lot. What I can do in an hour and a half or an hour and a bit is a lot less, but hopefully by the end of the session, you'll have a better understanding of where Nvivo fits in a qualitative research project and how it can help in some cases, and sometimes it might not be the best tool to use. So really just that that back and forth between knowing when to use Nvivo for your information needs. So the purpose today is really to go through some of these different features. We're going to talk about what Nvivo is and how it's structured. Also, what type of data can you use with Nvivo? So how can you import different formats? We obviously think a lot about qualitative research in the sense of conducting interviews, transcribing those interviews, and then putting those interviews in Nvivo. But it can allow for other formats to be imported and also to be analyzed. So I'll talk a bit about those different formats. We'll talk a bit about encapture, which is a nice feature that's kind of unique to Nvivo that allows you to capture web content in a way that's pretty straightforward. Given the time that we have today, I'll just mention and explain what encapture can do, but we won't actually use encapture today. We'll talk obviously about the importance of coding. That's probably the main purpose of using qualitative data analysis software. And so if you decide to use Nvivo or another tool, obviously you're going to want to use it to code. And that's where that no highlighters required title comes from. This is really another process for you to highlight your content, code it appropriately, and then sort of discover relationships between the different codes that you've used within your project. So we'll talk a bit more about that today. We're also going to talk about the value of classifications and how that can be useful, again, depending on the size of your project, depending on the breadth of your project. It could be something that's worth investigating, but at least you'll know what this feature does and determine later on if this is something that you can apply to your own project. And lastly, we're going to give you a snapshot of the different queries that you can use in Nvivo. Again, depending on the type of question that you have, Nvivo has predefined queries that are there, really, again, to help you explore and discover those relationships or those emerging ideas that come from your project, that come from your data. So today's workshop, again, as Jada mentioned, is going to be using Nvivo 12 Plus for Windows. I just want to mention that early on because there are differences between the Mac version and the Windows version. And so you can use Nvivo on a Mac, no problem. There are just some features that aren't necessarily at the same place, or there might, when I show you, they might be at different locations in Nvivo on Mac, but they also just might be missing because Nvivo on Mac only was developed a few years ago, and they still haven't sort of built in all the same features as the ones that are available on the Windows version. So you might be seeing differences or just some absent features when you're using it on a Mac. I also want to mention in the context of using Nvivo at U Ottawa, Nvivo, there is a site license that you can use. So you can go to the IT's software page on the U Ottawa website, and you can download Nvivo for a 3-year period. So that's something that you can take advantage of as a U Ottawa either student or researcher. So that's just something I wanted to mention as well, so that you're aware that you can access that if need be. If you want to test it out before downloading, you can also check out access through Student Labs, which is an online feature that you can access through the library's website. So you can actually connect to our physical labs remotely so that you can test out Nvivo if you want to just play around with it before downloading and installing it. So by the end of the workshop, although it is there's quite an agenda there on the previous slide. What I'm hoping that you'll be able to do by the end of this workshop is know how to import various sources, how to code documents using nodes, and how to at least run basic queries to start exploring your data. So before I actually talk about this slide, I'm just going to swing over to Nvivo and just start by explaining you a little bit about the layout. So once you install Nvivo, you launch it, this is the first screen you'll see. And you'll notice that there are different things that you can do from this screen. Primarily, I'm going to talk about the blank project, but also I'm going to come back later on to the sample project. So this is a sample project that's been built with Nvivo that's available to everyone who downloads the software. And whenever you look at a tutorial online or look at instructions on the Nvivo help pages, you're going to see references to the sample project. So we're going to go to it later because it has lots of great content that's already been coded. So we'll explore the sample project later, but that's just to give you a sense of what's here when you're looking at these two options. So I'll start with a blank project, and we'll call this January 27th for today's date. And we're going to create our Nvivo project. And so the project itself is an NVP file. And the NVP file will allow you to basically store all the files that you're going to import into it. And this NVP file you can save obviously on your computer, you can save it in the cloud, you can use it on another computer that does have Nvivo installed. If you're working on a Mac, the file extension is NVPX, so that's just an important distinction. You can open up a Mac project on a Windows computer, but if you want to share a Windows project, you can convert it so that someone with a Mac can open it on their computer. So that's important, for instance, if you're working collaboratively on a project, just making sure that people have the same version of Nvivo, and also just making sure that you can communicate between Mac and Windows environments. So once the project is created, I'm just going to close these quick start steps and just quickly talk about the layout. So what Nvivo is not a Microsoft product, but for those of you who've used Word or PowerPoint or whatever, you probably noticed that it's very similar in terms of the interface. And they've purposefully done that so that it's an easy way to sort of find your way around. Very intuitive, very user-friendly. And so at the top, you have different ribbon, or you have a ribbon with different tabs, so you can access different features. And on the left-hand side, you have quick access to the primary things you're probably going to use most frequently within Nvivo. So obviously your data, so this is where you'll be able to access your files. Once we import things, then you're going to have easy access to the codes. And we're going to talk today about case classification, so we're going to go into this section as well. Now, there are other features that you'll notice towards the bottom. We're not going to have time today to explore these, so just know that they're there if you need to access those later on. So on the slide, we can see here that we can access different, or we can import different types of data sources. Obviously, primarily speaking, we usually think of it in terms of downloading and using documents. So documents can be in Word format, they can be in text format, but you can also bring in PDFs. Some people like to use Nvivo for literature reviews. So they'll download articles that they think they want to consider for their lit review, bring those into Nvivo, set up a project just for the lit review, create some nodes, and start highlighting and annotating their readings. So that's another way that you can use Nvivo with PDFs. Some people have scanned images that are saved as PDFs as well. You can use those as well in your project. You can also import different types of audio and video files. You can see quite a few file extension options there on the screen. So you can download those different types, and I should say import, not download, but bring those into your project as well. And the value of doing that, and I'll show you an example, is you can bring in an audio file and transcribe directly from within Nvivo. And so that could be interesting, for instance, if you wanted to just listen to the audio and transcribe directly into your project, you can do that as well. You can also bring in pictures. So if you have different, again, file formats for pictures, you can bring those in. I like to give an example where if you're in education, for instance, and you're doing a sort of a content analysis of different classrooms, you can take pictures of classrooms and then bring that in, and you can actually code pictures as well. So you can compare setups in different classes in different schools and just do that type of analysis. So that's an example of how you could use pictures, but obviously it expands way beyond that simple example. You can also bring in data sets. So if you have if you've done an online survey, for instance, you can import that in an Excel format, and then that allows you to capture the close-ended questions, but as well, you'll be able to analyze and code the open-ended questions. So you can run queries, for instance, that utilize those closed questions. So if you have demographic information, or if you have yes or no, or if you have scales, you can say, show me all the responses for people who gave this a 5 out of 10, what they said about this in terms of looking at their open-ended questions as well. You can do that type of work with data sets. So that's interesting, and that's kind of a pretty cool feature, in my opinion, where you can have that and combine that information within your Nvivo project. And lastly, as I mentioned earlier, there's a feature called encapture. Oddly enough, this plugin only works on Chrome and a very old browser, Internet Explorer. So if you're still using that, you can use InCapture on that browser, although I think that's pretty much almost dead in the water. So most of you, I think, probably will be using something like Chrome. So if you are on Chrome, you can add the InCapture extension. And what that allows you to do is to really take a snapshot of a page. So for instance, if you're looking at media websites and you want to every day go and capture the home page, or if you want to follow the evolution of a news story and capture that page every day or at different times throughout the day, you can do that and go and take a capture, and automatically that page is saved as a PDF, and then you can download that or import that into your Nvivo project. So that's one thing you can do with InCapture. The other nice thing too is that you can use it with social media. And so with social media, you can capture content from Twitter, you can capture content from Facebook, and that allows you to get a good chunk of data from those different websites if need be. So for social media, for Twitter, for instance, you can do a search on a hashtag, and then you can grab a capture at that point in time of the most recent tweets with that hashtag. So to be honest, when you're using this with Twitter or with Facebook, it's really based on the API of those two different services, and and basically it'll capture the most recent tweets. So it won't do a retrospective capture of all the tweets using a particular hashtag since the beginning of Twitter, for instance. So just to be cognizant of that reality when you're using InCapture for social media. If you do have questions about that, feel free to email me after the webinar. I'll be more than happy to give you more insight into InCapture. So to download or to import, I keep saying download, but I mean import. So to import information, you can use the import tab at the top in Nvivo. And you have different options that Nvivo is already giving you. So you can obviously use stuff that you've captured online within Capture. You can just basically find your files using this option here. And then you have a few other options along the way here that you can sort of choose from. But most of them, you'll just be able to access this from the files. And from here, it'll just be browsing on your computer and finding the appropriate files that you need. And then all the formats that are acceptable will be available, and you can pick and choose what you want to download or what you want to import. So I'm just going to go ahead and click all of these for now and just click on Open and Import. And we'll just give this a few seconds to bring those all into my project. While that's happening, just a quick note that you can organize your files by folder within your project. So this step you only do once. Once things are imported, you can then organize them and you can move them around if you want, but you won't need to import these every time you use your project. So these are now embedded in the project itself. So whenever I open this NVP file again, all these files will be here. So you can see here there's a mix of PDF files, there's an audio file, there are some Word documents that are there as well, and there's also a picture. So these are right now in my data files area. This is where if I wanted to, I can right click and I create a new folder if I want to organize things. So if I have different groups of people that I've interviewed, I could organize them that way. If I want to separate my articles from my transcripts, I can do that as well. So I can play around and create as many folders and organize all of this as need be. Also, what's interesting here is that once they're in, you can double click on something and it will open up in the project itself. And this is the third sort of work area in the software. So we've got access to the left-hand column menu here. Once you're on one of these options, it'll display here sort of in the middle. And then when you open something, this becomes the work area. So you can sort of click through the different articles that you have or the different files that you open. They'll all open up in different tabs. So if I open up the picture, for instance, I can have that as well. And then I can see all of these files within my document.
I just ask a quick question.
Sure.
We have a question in the chat about, do you have to save as you go along in case of a crash?
That's a good question. So Nvivo will actually prompt you, I think, every 15 minutes to save, but you can definitely hit the save button along the way if you're afraid of that happening. I've seen Nvivo really slow things down on occasion, depending on a task that you're trying to do. If you're running, for instance, a query and for whatever reason you put in the wrong criteria and it's taking a long time, it can sometimes freeze, but it usually it doesn't restart, but it'll unfreeze, I guess, on its own. Sometimes it's just being very patient with the software. But that's a good question, and periodically you can hit the save button, or just simply when the prompt shows up, you can just click yes on saving that.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yep, you're welcome. So right now we're also seeing information about how many codes are used in each document and how many references. Right now, obviously, it's all at 0, but that's the easy part, right? That's the simple step of just bringing in your files. And once they're here, they're in your project and you're good to go. So that's the easy part. Now it'll be the fun part of talking about coding all of this. So some people have asked me in the past, does Nvivo transcribe automatically? And although that would be a nice feature, it doesn't do that at the moment. You can transcribe manually within Nvivo, so you can actually open up an audio file, listen to the playback within your project, and then transcribe also within the project. I'll show you that in a moment. There are some transcription services that are available online. One thing I often mention about this is just be careful about confidentiality. Depending on the agreements that you have that you've signed with your participants, or I should say your participants have signed when agreeing to take part in your research study, it's important to make sure that you've either built that in, and that you check if you're using a free service online where you can upload an audio file and then automatically it'll generate a transcript. Those do exist, but just be careful what happens to that audio file. Does it store it on their servers? Does it exist somewhere? Is someone able to access that? Just be sure that you've checked all the boxes before agreeing to participate or to upload one of those transcripts on one of those sites before the transcription is generated. So there's nothing wrong. I mean, it is a long and tedious process to transcribe. I can totally relate to that process. And I agree that it would be nice if it would do it automatically. But there's value in doing it yourself in the sense that you'll get a better idea of what your participant is saying. And also you'll have a sense of the tone if that's something that you want to capture as well when you're coding. Listening to the audio file can help you get a sense if the person is very enthusiastic or pretty lackluster in how they're talking about a particular topic or answering a question. So you can import transcriptions as sources, as mentioned on the slide. If you are transcribing outside of Nvivo and you're using Word, I highly recommend that you use styles in Word. And I did open a document just quickly, or a transcript earlier on. If you're not familiar with styles in Word, styles are usually in your home button if you're using this version. And then you can sort of, as you're seeing me sort of go over these different options, you can see the formatting is changing in the transcript itself. And so if you're using headings and you consistently use them across your transcript, using headings in your Word documents and then bringing those as transcripts into your Nvivo project, you'll be able to use an auto-coding feature that Nvivo has that relies on the formatting of a document. So if you're using styles, and if I click on this title here, Q1, connection to Down East, notice when I'm here, my cursor's here, it's heading 1. And you can also notice if I scroll down to section 2, right now, this, if I reapply that, it'll be now heading 1 as well, same format. Same thing for question 3 or section 3 here as well. And so if I use this consistently across my transcripts, and I know oftentimes interviews are semi-structured, so depending on the responses, you might be asking follow-up questions, so things may change. But if you organize by these main headers, what happens when you use the auto-coding feature in Nvivo, it will automatically code all of these sections separately and create a node for Q1, a node for Q2, a node for Q3, and it will automatically combine all the responses for all of your participants across those different sections. So that could be interesting because it would allow you to see all the responses to Q1 across all of your transcripts. And you can decide just to focus on that and to just code that more in depth with your own coding as you're looking through those sections. So that's something I wanted to mention quickly about the format feature in Word if you decide to use that using the styles. Also, if you do your transcription directly in Nvivo, this is newer to the version 12 of the software. It allows you to actually apply styles within Nvivo. This used to not be the case. Now it is possible. So you can do that work within Nvivo as well. As I mentioned, you can transcribe interviews directly within Nvivo. There's actually an option to play back an audio or video file, and then also to set it up so that you select the transcribe mode, which will allow you to then type the transcript as you're listening to the audio file. And lastly, on the slide, you can see that you can export a transcript, and then if you want to apply styles in Word, you can do that, and then bring that back into Nvivo as a nicely formatted Word document. So let's have a look back at Nvivo, and I'll just double click on this audio file here. And that will open up on the right. So I can see here the timeline for this particular audio clip. And when I open up an audio or video file, I get an audio or video tab that appears, and this allows me to play back my my file. Now, before I start, right now I'm just in regular play mode. If I want, I can then click on this option here to edit, and that activates the transcribe mode, which is right here in the play mode area. So we've got these three options. So I'm going to click on this last one here. And that now makes this table, once I start playing back, I'll be able to type content in this table. So if I click on play, I don't think you're going to hear the audio, which is fine. So I'm just going to put the volume down here on my computer. There we go. So right now the file is playing back. And this allows me to start typing in the content. So I can go ahead, if I had a question, I could type that in. If I hit enter, I can type in the response. I would recommend, if you're doing this transcribe mode, to put everything in the same column, or in the same cell, I should say, so that as you're playing things back, you'll actually be able to copy and paste this and stick that into Word and apply the formatting if you want for your transcript. If I hit the pause button, it will allow me to catch up to what's been said, obviously. And then also I can use these different options. I know these are smaller buttons here, but I can play back. If I click on this option here, it's skip back. And if I click on this, notice where the blue cursor is right now. If I hit this, it's going to jump back 5 seconds, jump back another 5 seconds. And actually, when I'm in play mode, I can hit this button and automatically listen to the last 5 seconds again. So that's obviously useful, so you don't have to stop and try to find back. You can click this a few times as well. If you notice when I hover over this button, there's a little box that pops up that explains the skip back feature. If you're on a Windows computer and you have the F9 key on your keyboard, you can hit that button, automatically head back. You can also hit the the F4 button to pause. And the idea behind these shortcut keys on your keyboard is to allow you to not rely on the mouse, so that when you're transcribing, you can be more efficient and just use the keyboard. So you can hit F4, take a pause, hit at F8 as it's playing back to jump back 5 seconds. You can change that default if you realize that you're clicking F8 twice every time to skip back 10 seconds. You can change that parameter in your options so that every time you do hit the skip back button, the F9, you'll automatically go back 10 seconds. So some more advanced info there if you need it. Also worth noting is that you can take advantage of the option to reduce the playback speed. So we might have done this, or you might have done this on YouTube when you're listening to a webinar. You can fast forward so that the person doesn't take forever to explain a concept, which is maybe something you'll do if you're listening back to this webinar later. But what you can do on this is you can actually slow things down. So you can slow it up to 50%. And if you notice now when I play back, you can see obviously the time stamp is moving very slowly. And this is great because then the person will be talking slowly and you'll be able to type. And so if you have a fast talker, you can slow them down and catch up as you're transcribing. So that's a nice feature to have in the software. I don't know of anyone who would play it back at faster speed, but you can do that as well, up to 200% faster. So that's obviously something you can try out. if you find that the person is a slow talker and you're actually a fast typer, which is probably not always the case when you're transcribing. So those are nice options to use here, the playback options when you're transcribing. So once all of this is done, you can actually copy this cell, put that into a Word document, and then apply your formatting throughout. If I go back to my example in Word, you might have noticed that there's formatting applied a lot in this document. So obviously there are the headers. There's also some heading that's being used for the participants or the interviewer and the interviewee. But also they've used this format here for the questions so that you can distinguish them from the answers when you open up a transcript in Nvivo. And that's kind of useful when you're running queries because sometimes you'll see responses to a search that you've done. If you're doing, for instance, a text word search and you're noticing that it's in italics, well, that might indicate that, oh, that word is showing up in the question more than in the answers. So visually, it's a nice cue to have. So just some tips in terms of how you can structure things in your documents. So again, that is just a quick intro to the transcribing feature within Nvivo. As you can see here, you can also apply, as I've mentioned earlier, this is new to Nvivo now. You can apply the italics, the bold, and so on here. Preferably, I still think there are more options in Word. So that's my practice is to sort of copy this and stick that into Word afterwards. And then save the Word document, bring that back in as a transcript. If I open up this one, you'll notice it's the same one for Barbara that we were looking at. So we've got that here. Even though your transcript is brought in as a Word document, you can actually edit. So if you notice any typos after you've done your transcript, you can always make corrections in the document itself. And then apply, as I said earlier on, some styles as well. So I'll just close out these options for now. We'll get back to these in a few moments. So I'll just go back to the PowerPoint and look at Encapture, which I've mentioned already. There's one point here on the slide that I didn't talk about is the privacy issue. So when you're using the Encapture extension on Chrome, if you're accessing that feature within Facebook and Twitter on their websites, it will ask you to give Encapture access to your own personal information from those two websites. So if that's not something that you want Encapture to gather, you can create a blank research account on Facebook or Twitter so that when you do use Encapture, it's not actually collecting any meaningful data from your personal information. I think the rest I've covered already. I forgot that I had this slide in the presentation, so it's just reiterating something that I mentioned previously. So coding sources is obviously, now that you have imported your files into your project, what you'll want to do is start thinking about how to code that information. And today's workshop is not really about coding. There's lots of material, and I'll talk about that on the next slide. But the nodes is the word that's used in Nvivo for codes or themes. And so when I refer to a node, essentially think of it as a theme or as a category that you'll be using when coding. As you can see from the little image on the right, you can code parts of text, obviously, so a transcript. You can capture parts of an image. You can also code parts of a timeline if you wanted to. Obviously, there's not a lot of data tied to that information, but most people will use the nodes in relation to textual content. So you can see here that anything can be coded with a node. And once you open a node, then you can see the references across all your sources. And that's useful because then you can see how that node's been applied across 10 different interviews, for instance, or 10 different images or whatever you have in terms of your data. Also, what's important to remember is when you're coding, it's good to get into the practice of coding one piece of text, sometimes if it's applicable to more than one node. That allows you to create relationships later on, or to identify relationships between ideas when you're running different queries. So there are many approaches in qualitative data methodology or in qualitative research methodology that exists in terms of coding. Again, this is not the point in today's workshop, but I do want to highlight 2 resources that you can use to find examples of information on how to code. We have a great underused resource called Sage Research Methods. And Sage is a huge publisher in the social sciences, and they have produced this research methods tool that allows you to explore different resources, textbooks on methods, some particular books that have been written about methodologies and so on. And so you can run a keyword search in that tool and find a wealth of information. So if you want to explore that, I'd highly recommend it. If you need to learn more about coding or any other type of research methodology, it's really a wonderful tool. And I also have a link here to Omni, where you can find additional sources in our library's collection. So Omni, by the way, is our library catalog if you don't know what that is. So in terms of practical ways of thinking about this, you can create your nodes obviously upfront. So before you start out, you can think of how you want to organize your nodes. You can add to them as you're reading your transcripts and coding. So it can be an inductive process where it emerges throughout the process of coding. It can be a combination of both. So really depends on your approach to your project. You can also think of your codes or your nodes as a coding structure. So you can create a hierarchy within Nvivo so that your nodes have a higher level, what are called parent nodes, and then child nodes for those subcategories. If you're working collaboratively, I highly suggest that you provide descriptions for your nodes or simple definitions that'll allow all members of your team to understand what that node means and how to apply it. So think of it as a code book, which you'll often see in research methods for qualitative research. Obviously, we think primarily of nodes as being linked to themes, and that's primarily what you'll be doing when you're actually coding is you'll think of the themes and categorize them using the nodes. But also what I've seen is the possibility of using them to capture attitudes, for instance. So is your participant talking positively or negatively about something? Again, thinking about the queries, and we'll explore those later. If you create a node for positive or negative, for instance, you can then run a query saying, show me all the positive comments related to this particular theme. And so that's something you can do if you set it up that way with your nodes. And I know this is a more difficult thing to capture when reading a transcript, but sometimes you'll have a sense of how people are responding to a question, and you could capture that information. The sample project, which we'll get to later on, introduced me to the idea of creating a node just simply called memorable quotes. And I find this interesting because it allows you to really just highlight that one comment that has really hit the nail on the head, and you know that you want to include that in your final thesis or your article. You want to really bring that idea out to the forefront. If you create a memorable quotes node, it really facilitates the retrieval of that. Obviously, you don't want to use this too frequently because then it really just puts that aside as being a very useful option to have. But if memorable quotes is something you want, I found that really interesting in the sample project and have been sort of promoting that use in my workshops. And obviously that's pretty straightforward, but think of the nodes that you create in relation to your research questions, your hypotheses, and just making sure that you're collecting or you're capturing what your research question is trying to answer as you're creating your nodes. So we'll just jump back to Nvivo before talking about classifications. So another question I often get about Nvivo is, oh, this is great. I'll create my nodes and then boom, it will apply this systematically across all my sources, right? The answer to that is no. Nvivo is software to help you produce your analysis, but the coding part is really where you need to put your researcher hat on and apply the coding yourself. It is a manual process. There is an automated feature that allows you to auto code based on coding that you've already applied. So let's say you have 25 different transcripts and you manually code 5 of them. You can ask Nvivo to run through the rest of your transcripts And based on how you coded those first 5, well, the next 20 Nvivo will try to do a good job through an algorithm to sort of match the coding that you've done for your first 5 and apply that to the other ones in your project. So I don't know if that makes sense, but the auto coding is there if you need to, if you want to try it out. But again, it's based on what you've already done. So you'll need to actually open up a source and start creating some coding for those. So I'm going to start actually by clicking on nodes right here. And as we can see, there's nothing in this right column. I'm going to right click. By the way, I didn't mention this, but right clicking in Nvivo is your best friend. If you're stuck on something, just try right clicking. You'll see some options show up, and then probably there's a solution to your problem within that menu. So right clicking is worthwhile. So I'm going to go ahead and click on new node right here. And I'm going to start with a broad or a parent node, call it education. And I'll just click on OK. That's my first node. I'm going to right click on education, choose new node, and we're going to see that that's actually going to create a child node that's going to sit under education. So I'm going to click on this and say elementary. So elementary education. And I'm going to click one as well here for another new node, right click, and I'm going to click secondary. Okay, so these are just showing you some child nodes here for the parent node. And if I wanted to create, there's my pop-up, someone had that question earlier on about saving. There's my 15-minute reminder. I'm going to go ahead and save that. And then the other thing too that I mentioned is the fact that we can create some attitude nodes. Now, in the newer version of Nvivo has created a category here called sentiment, and they have predefined some sentiments, I guess, some attitudes. So positive, very, or moderately, negative, moderately, or very. So you've got those options that are available if you want. Now, what I find more useful is to have all my nodes on one screen so that when I code, it's easier for me to go ahead than having to click here, capture the sentiment, go back to nodes, capture the theme. So because this didn't exist before, I just created a node here called attitudes. And I sort of carry that through in the newer version as well. Right click, and we'll just do very quickly positive. And right click again, new node, negative. So before that pop-up showed up, I didn't want to mention that you can keep going on with the hierarchy if you want. So I can create a narrower term here for secondary if I wanted to. So again, right-clicking new node would allow me to do that. So this very quickly is just showing you what I've done to create nodes. So again, you might notice that my nodes are very short. Again, that's just to maximize my efficiency when using the software, because as I open up my sources on the right, this screen obviously will be squished a little bit in the middle. And so that information tends to get cut off if my nodes are very long. And having helped students in the past, I've seen examples of nodes that are sentences or phrases that are very long and that have the same structure. They'll have the same beginning, and then it's only the ending that's different. And so that gets cut off, and it makes it difficult to create or to actually go through the process of coding. So I tend to keep things short and to the point. Really, it'll depend on your project and how you structure this. But that's just my my tip on creating nodes. So once the nodes are created, obviously this is a very short list to get us started, but I'll go back to files and I'll double click on Barbara again to open up her transcript. And I'll click back on nodes so that I can actually see them here in this column. So this is my practice of opening up the source and then opening up the nodes. And then as I'm going to read through the document, I'm going to just highlight a paragraph, a sentence, usually try to provide more context to the response so that when you're actually opening up nodes, you actually see not just a word, but either a sentence or a few sentences, and if need be, a paragraph as well. So it really depends on how you want to go about it, but try to at least give a bit of context so that when you reread it later on, you know what she was responding to and you get a better sense of the full response. So for the sake of this illustration here. We're just going to highlight this first paragraph, this first response. We don't worry about reading the content and how I'm going to code it. That's not the point. So the mechanics of it is just to highlight first, then you click and you will drag and you will drop it. So let's say she's talking about high school. So I'm going to drop that here. And that's my first file being coded. So the interview with Barbara and the first reference. So my first use of this particular node. Let's say she's also talking about this positively. I'm going to keep that highlighted. Click again, drag and drop on positive. And now this first paragraph is coded at positive and it's secondary. So it's a very mechanical process, very straightforward. Highlight, drag and drop, highlight, drag and drop. It's not too complicated. It's just very, I won't say tedious, but you know, you're going to go through the transcript and you're going to say, okay, now she's talking, let's say negatively about elementary school, which I know she's not if you're actually reading the verbatim, but let's pretend. So let's do that like that. Let's just scroll down a little bit more, highlight another section. Let's say she's talking about secondary. This time she's negative. So you can see those numbers are changing as we're going through the transcript. One thing I wanted to mention as well, and I often get this question, well, how do you know what you've done? This isn't turned on by default, but you can turn on what are called coding stripes. And that option is here at the top. So I'm going to click on coding stripes. And you have different options when you click on that. So you can say just the recent coding. I'm going to go ahead and just do all coding because we don't have that many nodes. But now, I don't know if you're seeing my video when I'm doing this, but you can sort of, you know, drop your head towards the right, and then you'll be able to see in this little section here which nodes have been applied to which sections. So I know that this paragraph is secondary and negative. If I scroll back up a little bit, I'm going to see this section here is negative elementary, and so on. So this area here can be, you can get a scroll bar here at the bottom that's very, very small, and that allows you to navigate through your entire list of codes that have been used in this particular transcript. But that can be useful because then you can sort of see where you are. Okay, I know that I'm at this point. Nothing beyond this has been coded, so I can stop here and continue later on if I need to. So that again is the coding stripes. All nodes, all coding is selected, and as I go through, I can see that. You might have noticed there's a highlight button here. Highlighting is only one color, so and it's not applied to the nodes, but just to the sections if I scroll back up. So that's really not all that useful. It's always yellow, and you might be able to change the color in the options, but it doesn't do much good in terms of helping you really see how you've coded it. So you can see the overlap here. You can see which nodes have been applied and so on. So again, highlight, drag and drop. I think it's pretty straightforward. That's the easiest way. Nvivo does give you other options. If we go to this paragraph here and I highlight that, if you want, you can actually use the code button here and then select the nodes here for whatever reason if you prefer this option, or you can click on code. The advantage of doing this, if you click on that option, is that it allows you to choose more than one at a time. So if in this section she's talking about elementary and also about secondary, I can click that with the control key being hit at the same time. I can choose more than one option and hit the OK button when I'm done. And automatically, instead of dragging and dropping 3 times, those 3 nodes are selected at once. So that's through this option here for coding. And lastly, the other option is to highlight again. That's inevitable. You'll have to highlight and then right click, and you can code this way as well. You can do Control F2, as you can see from the shortcut, keyboard shortcut if you want. So doing this will do the same thing as clicking on this option here. You'll also notice that you can uncode. So if by accident you've coded a section, you can highlight it again and uncode it. So that's something you can try as well. While we're at it here, you can also notice there's an annotation feature. Some people like to do that. They add comments about a particular section. So your notes, your thoughts, your ideas about this particular comment, you can create an annotation. This is very similar to the comments feature when you're tracking changes in Word, or if you're using footnotes, it's the same idea. So if I click on a new annotation, I can add that here. Great comments or whatever, something more meaningful, obviously, but you could add those comments here, and then you can always track that back later on. So when you're reading, you'll see this is blue, meaning that there's an annotation here for that section. Okay. So in a nutshell, that's how you can go ahead and code within the software itself. Once that's done, you can also, as I mentioned, take advantage of the auto coding. So that's sort of buried here in this option. And again, that will be based on stuff that you've previously coded. So it's important to do a fair number of manual coding options before trying this out. You can always test it out, and then it'll always give you the opportunity to undo if you need to, or if you're not satisfied, you can actually tweak it. But it'll give you a good heads up on what might be worth coding in future documents. So you can always give it a try. But that's where a lot of people get disappointed. They say, oh, I thought Nvivo would do all of this for me. It's not that sophisticated. So you still need to be responsible for the analysis that you're doing with the software. Let's talk quickly about classifications. Classifications are useful when you want to analyze the data down the road. So if you decide to use classifications, I'll give you some examples of when this would be useful, but the classifications are usually great if you're capturing, for instance, demographic information about your participants. And you want to run a query later on to show, okay, well, let's do it by age. I want to see responses to this theme within my participants that are aged 20 to 29. And then I want to compare those to the 30 to 39, 40 to 49 group, and 50 plus. So you could do that if you wanted to, if you're using classifications. So let's say you have all these cases in your project. So these are all your transcripts. Or you can transfer this to other situations. Let's say you're doing content analysis of letters that you've received as part of that's your data, and you want to analyze those letters. You could have letter 1, letter 2, letter 3, etc. So you can take this example and apply it to different scenarios. You're going to create a classification sheet. Usually I call it participant. And then for that classification, you're going to have attributes. And so here as an example, you might have age, gender, education level. So you would have those, and for each attribute, you would then have a set of values. And once you have this, then you're going to apply this to each participant. Now, you can do this in Nvivo. So if you want, you can create a classification sheet, add the attributes, add the values, and then apply those to the participants in Nvivo. Or if you have already collected this information and you have it in a spreadsheet, you can import that spreadsheet and put it directly into a classification sheet. And then you can just associate that information with the right participant. You can also set it up in your classification sheet in Excel, for instance, where you would have the participant's name as the first column, and automatically, when you import that classification sheet, Nvivo will assign it to the right participant. So let's use the example now of creating it within the project. So I'm going to go back to Nvivo, and this time I'm going to go back at the top to, or actually I'm going to click here on case classification. So we don't have any right now. I'm going to go ahead and right click and create a new classification. And I'm going to call it participants. Or just participant, there we go. Click on OK, and that's my classification sheet. So right now, obviously, it's empty. There's nothing here. I need to create the attributes. So I'm going to go ahead and right click and click on new attribute. And we'll do age. And before I click OK, I'm going to click on values right here, sort of a hidden tab. And these two are there by default. I cannot delete them, but I can add. So 20 to 29. Let me just add a few here. Bear with me. There we go. Let's do those. And we'll click on OK. And that's my first attribute. I'll do another one just quickly. I'll do a new attribute. We'll do gender, add a value, do male, and we'll do female. And you can add non-applicable or whatever if you want. Oh, that's already there. Okay, let me just remove that. I don't know if it'll allow me. So I'll just put other and we'll do that and click OK. You can always tweak these later if need be. And so you have that here, and I'm just going to do one last one so that we have something to work with. And we'll do education level, and we'll do high school, college, and university. All right, so we've got that created. Now we need to create cases. And in order to create cases, we'll go to the tab just or the option just above on the right, on the left, and we'll create a new case, and we'll call it, we'll use Barbara. And before I click OK, I'm going to go ahead and click on attribute values, and I'm going to click on the new sheet that I created. Now, obviously, you're not memorizing all these steps, and I understand that a lot of this workshop is sort of a show and tell or show and do, hopefully, that you'll be able to try some of these later on. You'll be able to refer back to the webinar, but also what I'll do is I always make myself available. So if you need to get a refresher on this, feel free to contact me later on. So now we've got participant. I'm going to choose the values here. So unassigned is the default. So let's say she's 20 to 29, female, and she's completed university degree. Click on OK. And that's our first case. Now, this on its own is not tied to her transcript, so we need to go back to the file and open up the interview, which is already here. And what you can do is you can select each time she answers and assign it to that case, or you can just choose the whole thing, Control A, that's the entire transcript. And if I want, I'm going to open up the case here, and I'm just going to click and drag that on Barbara. And that is now, as you can see here, Barbara is the case. She's been, the whole thing has been selected. If I scroll through this, it's all pink here. And that's her case identity, I guess. And so that will allow me later on to run that query where I can say, show me all women who have a university degree, what they thought about this particular theme. So think of your project. Sometimes if you have a group that's homogeneous and they share all the same characteristics, you've looked at university students in their first year, that's a very small group. Yes, you might want to capture some demographic information, but it might not be worth your while to create this classification sheet. If you have a small sample where you've got 5, 10 participants, you know everyone, you can easily identify who they are, what their characteristics are, then again, you might not need it. When you start moving to a larger sample and you have participants that share different characteristics, that's where it might be interesting and worthwhile to create a classification sheet. So again, the steps for this, I know it's a very step-by-step approach that I did, and I know that you haven't memorized this, but know that at least you know it exists as a feature. And when the time comes, if you decide to do a classification sheet, I actually have a step-by-step guide that I can share with you. So feel free to touch base at that point. So that's an overview of the classification. So let me what I'm going to do before we talk about that, I'm just going to close this project. And the reason I'm doing that is we're going to move on to the last part of the workshop, which is really talking about the queries that you can run in Nvivo. And in order to have something meaningful, I'm going to open up the sample project. And I'll just give you a quick overview of what this project is. So this is a real project that was done quite a few years ago now, where they looked at changes that were occurring in a community known as the Down East region. And I mean to look this up every time. It's either in North or South Carolina. So it's a coastal area of the United States in one of those two states. And what they've done is they did some surveys, they did some interviews, they also looked at media and news articles. So you can sort of see that here in this section of their project, where they've got all that organized by different type of data. So either it's literature, interviews, so we can look at the interview. There's Barbara. So that interview I was using was actually from this project. You have some audio and video files interspersed with the transcript as well. And you can see how they've applied the coding, right? So they've used 43 different codes or nodes in Barbara's interview for a total of 197 references. So 197 times they've used different nodes in her transcript. So this gives you a sense of who might have talked more about a topic, or there's a very quick just rundown of that information. But that's kind of nice. And then if we look at their nodes, you can sort of see it's a very simple structure. Although this project is very complex, they kept it simple in terms of the nodes that they've explored. And they don't have a lot of them as a hierarchy. Like only 4 have some child nodes, and they only go down 4 levels. So it's very, very to the point in terms of their structure. So this is a good example if you're just wanting to play around. Open this sample project up on Nvivo and have a look at what they did. Open up a transcript, look at how they applied, turn on the coding stripes, see how they've used those codes, etc. So this again is just a quick overview of that project. And so this was done, as I mentioned a few years ago, an actual project that was done by researchers at Duke University. So let's go back to the slides very quickly just to introduce a few basic queries. And I'll show you these in a moment with the sample project. But essentially, these are 2 quick and dirty queries that you can run. The word frequency is really just going to identify which are the nodes, or sorry, which are the words that appear more frequently within a particular interview, a set of interviews, the survey results you have, whatever it may be. You can pick and choose which sources you want to look at when you're running queries. So you can isolate just the interviews versus the survey results versus Twitter data, whatever it may be. I often will encourage folks to use this as a preliminary query just to see which are the words that show up more frequently. Can you gather some information, some insight into that by saying, okay, oh, I hadn't thought of this when I was thinking of my nodes. This word comes up a lot. Maybe it's worth including as a note. Things of that nature. The text search query, the second one on the screen, is very simple. It's like doing a Google search across your data. And so if you're interested in just finding a particular word or phrase among your interview transcripts, you can do that with the text search. I will show you the word frequency. The other one is pretty straightforward, so I'll skip over that. We'll head back to the project, and we're going to go to the Explore tab at the top. So in the Explore tab, just before we get started, there's this query wizard. I don't know if you remember wizards from Microsoft products. A long time ago, you could ask the paperclip to sort of show you some sort of task that you can do. I probably just gave you an indication of how old I am by talking about that. But anyways, the wizard here in Nvivo actually will ask you a set of questions and will prompt you to give some answers, obviously, and then it will suggest which query might be the best one. So if you're not sure which one to use, give the query wizard a try. It'll do its best to sort of guide you in choosing the right type of query. Text search, sorry, is the first one. Again, I'm going to skip on that one. It's pretty straightforward. I'm going to use the word frequency as our example. So when you click on a query, it opens up the query's parameters here on the right. And you can first off choose where to search. So I'm going to just choose the interviews. There's lots of files in this project, so I'm just going to isolate the interviews and choose those. And then we don't really need to see the 1,000 most frequent words. That's the default. If you want to be really thorough, you can do that. I'm going to choose the top 25. And you can choose how long the word has to be. So 3 letters is the minimum. I'm going to bump that up to 5. So show me words that have at least 5 letters. And then there's this grouping category, which is kind of neat. You can move this toggle down if you want to change. You can do exact matches, so it's just the word talk, for instance. If you do stemmed words, it'll find talk, talking, talker, etc. With synonyms, you can see it sort of will include words like speak. And then specializations and generalizations, they have definitions on their website of what that means. So if you want to look that up, you can, but then you're getting a bit broader than your original intent. So I'm going to leave it to exact match and just hit run query. So within our transcripts, these are the most frequently used words, and you can see how many times they're used. And you might be noticing on the screen that you have something like this, Henry. So Henry, if you remember, he's the interviewer. And so his name obviously shows up a lot. and obviously not useful, but you'll get a mix of that regardless when you run this type of search. If you want, you can right-click on Henry and say, I want him to be, or that name to be a stop word in the stop word list. So that means it's going to be ignored. So if I do that, I click OK, it's going to ignore that in this particular project. And so that's taking a bit more time than I thought. And if I rerun the query, that word will no longer appear in the results. So you can imagine how long that can be if you start tweaking everything, like word like things that might not be relevant, but you'll discover things like development, vision, community, and all of this table is interactive. So you can double click on a word. So if I click on fishing, I can double click on that. It's going to show me the 51 occurrences of that word within my transcripts as soon as that loads up. So taking a bit of time, there we go. So this is showing me now where the word fishing shows up in my interviews. And I can see right now I'm looking at Barbara's responses. So, and this you can see is a link, so I can actually click on that and it will jump into the transcript. It will highlight those words. And if I wanted to, I could from here highlight and go ahead and code. So that could be a way in to the coding if you wanted to by doing a word frequency. And then I'll see after that there's Charles' responses. If I go back down, there's a bit more in terms of Dorothy. And notice earlier I mentioned that the interview questions were in italics. Well, I can see here that the word fishing is actually in the question, and Dorothy's not really talking about fishing or just bad water quality in that example. So that's where the formatting can help you when you're running a query. You can see, oh, well, actually, Dorothy didn't really say anything about fishing. It's really more in the questions. So I know this is putting you in a situation where, first of all, you're not familiar with the content of this project, and but it's giving you an idea of what this query can give you. So those are the word frequency results. If I go back to the table here, I can also, if I turn my head to the right, I can see these different options here to help me display the information. So right now we're seeing a summary. I can click on word clouds. Now, I think word clouds are not as popular as they used to be. But if you like that, if you're more of a visual person, this word cloud is actually interactive. So I can double click on words here as well. And if I want, I can right click and I can actually export this word cloud as an image, stick that into a presentation or a poster. I can even tweak the colors if I wanted to. Again, maybe the popularity of this is sort of is no longer relevant, but anyways, it's there if you want. There's a tree map as well if you prefer to see this as a tree map, which for me doesn't mean much, but it's there. And also some cluster analysis presentation. So it's there if you need to. You can explore this on the website for Nvivo. They do provide some explanations of all those features if you want. I find the word cloud interesting if you want to have a look at it, but that's the word frequency query in a nutshell. So again, a good preliminary search that you might want to use at the beginning, just to get a sense of what your data has to say.
I have a question that has just come in.
The more advanced queries, if we look at these quickly as well, we've got the coding query, the matrix coding, and the crosstab. So the coding query is the one I like because it allows you to find those relationships between different nodes. So you can run a coding query and say, okay, show me all the responses that are positive, that talk about the economy. And you can run that query and show all the positive results. Obviously that you've coded with those two nodes. Now that's the caveat, right? So you have to make sure that when you're coding, you're applying multiple nodes. I've seen people where they just apply one node and they're trying to run a coding query. The relationships don't exist because you haven't coded the same paragraph with multiple nodes. The matrix coding is slightly different. It's going to create a table. I'm going to show you an example. This is where the value of using the attributes, you can combine those with the nodes. When I show you an example, it'll make more sense to visually see that one. And the crosstab is just a step up of the matrix coding. Let's say you wanted to isolate gender and then by age. So you could have female participants, 20 to 29, 30 to 39, 40 to 49, and then compare that to male, and then have a listing in the columns. In the rows, you could have the nodes. That would allow you to see that total by age and by gender. So that's the crosstab in a nutshell. So it's like a fancy way of preparing an Excel spreadsheet, but in Nvivo. So let me jump back to the project quickly, and we're going to go back to Explore, and I'll start off with a coding query. So the example I'm going to give you is that I know, again, you don't know too much about the project, and I sort of jump into these examples sometimes and assume that you know, but have to take a step back and know that you don't. So we're going to look at natural environment. So we know that's a theme that was addressed, and we know that folks also talked about policy management and real estate development. And we're going to see if there are sections of the transcripts that people talked about the natural environment at the same time that they talked about either policy management or real estate development. So it's one or the other, and the common denominator is natural environment. So hopefully that makes a bit of sense. So what we need to do is we need to go back here first again and choose our interviews. That's the first step. And then you're going to see the parameters for this search. Let me just expand that a little bit. So this is where it gets a little tricky. You'll need to go and say, I want to search for content coded at a particular node that I'm going to choose. So I'm going to start off with that common denominator, which is natural environment. So show me everything that people, all the sections that people talk about the natural environment. I want that as a node. I'm going to add a row to my search, but instead of searching for all of the selected codes or nodes or cases, I'm going to choose here any, which means or. All is and, any is or. So in this case, I'm going to go choose those two other nodes. I'm going to choose policy management, real estate development, one or the other. Okay. Did I choose that? Yes, there they are. So it's one or the other and natural environment. Let me run the query and we'll have a look, and that'll hopefully make more sense. So as this is running, we're going to see the results pop up momentarily at the bottom. And this is where, obviously, in an in-person scenario where we give these workshops in a lab, I would see either confused faces where I would add more explanation, or I would see people nodding and saying, yeah, I get it. So in the virtual environment, I'm hoping that my explanations are clear and the examples are sort of relevant and they speak for themselves. So now what we're looking at, and the best way to see this is if I turn on the coding stripes. This time, instead of choosing all, I'm going to go ahead and choose some selected items. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to choose those three. Those are the ones I want to see at this point. And so again, you get some neck exercises here as you turn your head towards the right. You're going to be able to see natural environment should appear across everything. So it should be pink all along these results. And then there's going to be some yellow for real estate development, and probably there's some blue as well for policy management. So I don't know if that makes sense, but this query is it's basically showing me everything that was coded at natural environment, but where there's overlap with either policy management or real estate development. This one here, this paragraph has all three. If I keep scrolling, most of them seem to be talking about real estate development and natural environment at the same time. There might be some cases where it's just policy management, but it seems to be real estate development and natural environment, and sometimes policy management. So that's where it really gets interesting. And that's where, again, I like to present these queries in this workshop, because at least you know what type of question you can ask that can help inform how you're going to code. And so that's really, I think, fascinating, where you start seeing those relationships, and then you'll be able to easily pull out some information for you as you interpret those results. Okay, so that is the coding query. So let me close that one down. And we're going to go to Explore again, and we're going to try this matrix coding. So the scenario I'm going to give you for this example is we're going to find out, we're going to use the case classification. So in this project, they've identified participants by township. So the Down East area, there's lots of different townships, and they've categorized their participants with that information. And so they know which participants come from which township. And they've also used some nodes related to the economy. So I'm just going to bring that one back here. So agriculture, fishing, jobs, and tourism. I'm going to build a search this time around. I'm going to build a table. We're going to identify the rows and the columns. So for the rows, I'm going to use the townships. And so I'm going to click on the plus sign here, and I'm going to select some items. And in order to do that, I'm going to go into the case classification. So we had just one earlier. We had one called participant. They have one called person, and they have a category or an attribute that's called township. I'm just going to expand that. I'm going to choose those townships. I'm going to choose all of them. Let's choose 5. Click on OK. Those are the rows for our table. And then in my columns, I'm going to choose the nodes related to the economy. So I'm going to choose nodes here, expand that section. Just click nodes, sorry. And economy, I'm going to go and pick and choose those 4. Click on OK. So think again of your scenario. It could be by age. It could be some nodes by theme. It could be age and positive, negative to see if are younger people more positive than older people or vice versa. Those are things you can ask with the software. So really the possibilities here are pretty far-reaching in terms of what you can do with this query. I like this one. So I'm going to run that search, and it's going to create a table, and slowly it's going to populate that table with numbers to indicate how many responses per node per township. And we sort of lose the townships here, so I'm just going to expand that. And so we can see here Straits, Harkers, Marshallburg, blah, blah, blah. And then I can see visually very quickly the economy of all the 4 categories that were talked about. Fishing is predominantly the one that comes up most frequently. And that's something you probably would have known just by coding. But this is interesting because then you can see, well, there's lots of participants from the Straits Township. They seem to talk a lot about fishing. And then second runner-up is jobs and the cost of living. And this table is dynamic, so you can double click on a cell. Let's choose this one, just for not choosing the biggest one. We'll choose Harkers Island fishing, and these are the responses from participants in Harkers Island. So that township, these folks have talked about fishing. This is their response. And as you scroll through, you can jump from one participant to the next. And there's, I forget who the first one was. Here's Susan and her responses and so on. And because I didn't select just the interviews, I also have some survey responses here as well. So we can see some open-ended questions or responses to open-ended questions that were tagged with fishing. So that's the matrix query, which I really, really appreciate. All right. Now, that's probably a lot more information than what you wanted or were hoping to get in this webinar. What I will do now is just go back and wrap things up in the PowerPoint and maybe answer questions if we have a few minutes left. So I just wanted to reiterate something that I mentioned a few times during the workshop. Nvivo is software that is there really, and I underline the word assist because it really is a tool to help you in the process. It does do things automatically here and there, but it doesn't do a full job of just coding everything for you and figuring stuff out. Another thing that we really didn't touch on in the software is there's a section where you can create some diagrams. And again, the expectation that I've seen from some students and researchers is that it'll create a concept map for you. The tool is there to help you build that diagram, build those relationships, but it's not something that automatically comes through without your researcher intervention, if I can put it that way. So the software is there to help you, and to make good use of it. It's really meant to know what it can do and what it can't do. As I mentioned also at the beginning, I really just skimmed the surface of some of the most basic features in the software. There's lots of stuff that you can do that I didn't show you today, but at least you know how to get started, how to import data, how to set up a coding structure, how to apply those nodes, and then how to run some queries. And the value of knowing which queries are available, I think, as I mentioned, really can help you decide how you want to code your content. One thing I didn't show you as well are predefined and reports that are there that you can run. So there are predefined reports based on nodes or based on files that you can go and explore in the report section of the tool. That'll be in your left-hand menu. At the bottom, you're going to see reports. You can check out what's there as predefined reports. So I'll leave it at that. I think I have one more slide with just some links that you'll be able to access. So there's the detailed online help, which is actually pretty good for some online help. QSR, which is the company that produces Nvivo, they've they have a YouTube channel with a few webinars that have been recorded. So if you need to go and get some other ideas, you can definitely go and explore their YouTube channel. And then these two books are available. The first one is only in print, and I consistently look to see if it's available as an online book for the library to purchase, but we only have a print copy in our collection. So unfortunately, in this day and age right now, it's not something that's easily accessible, but if you want to buy yourself a copy, this is my go-to book for learning more about Nvivo. It uses a sample project, it provides step-by-step guidance, but it also provides more of that behind the scenes, or what's the word I'm looking for? Some of the rationale for running different things in the software itself. So it's not just click here, click there, click there. It does provide that information, but it also provides context as to why you would want to do that task with Nvivo. So a great book, if I'm going to plug something, that's the one to buy if you're really interested in learning more about Nvivo. And the 2019 version, I think, relates to Nvivo 12, so it should be up to date. All right, you get to get a break from me talking all that time. Hopefully, you're still around and awake and still interested in the topic. And I don't know if Jada, you're seeing any chat questions or anything coming up.
There's just one question, and it came in sort of in that last section on coding and analysis. I guess I should say analysis. In a text search, what if we're analyzing interviews?
Jada, I don't know if you're on mute. I don't hear you. Oh, it's because I muted my computer. Sorry. I'm sorry.
Well,
we hear you.
That makes sense. Perfect. Okay, great. So this question came in when you were going through analysis of interviews. And so it's in text search. What if we're analyzing interviews in two different languages? Let's say we're using house and maison. What can we expect of the results?
So that's a great question. And so I think if the analysis is done and you have text in French and in English, if you're running a query, obviously, if you're running a word frequency or a text search query, you would have to use the words or the results would be in either language. If you decide that you're going to code and create a structure based on language, then you're going to essentially want to use just one language. So let's say even if you have texts in both languages, you might want to decide I'm going to code everything in English and just create a node structure based in English so that when you do run those queries later on, you'll be able to use the nodes in one language, but show results in both. I don't know if that answers the question, but.
I'll see if a follow-up comes through. Otherwise, there are no questions, just some thank yous. So I will reiterate that. Thank you so much. I know that I watched this workshop in November, but I still it's one of those tools that there's so much to offer that every time, even if it's the same workshop, you're going to come away with something new. So thank you very, very much for delivering this one to us, and maybe we'll get to a point where we can do an advanced one later on. Oh, and a follow-up thanks to that answer. And can we combine the results for house and maison when we want to analyze word frequency?
So word frequency, I guess that's a good question. For the word frequency, I think you would have to. I don't think it would work, to be honest. I'm thinking that because Nvivo is not smart enough to know that those are two different languages and then that those are two different words. Or it would identify them as two separate words and wouldn't see the relationship between both. So when running the word frequency, you'd almost have to do both, one in French, one in English. If you isolate, for instance, your transcripts into two different folders, that's how probably you would have to do it.
Okay, thank you very much. So we are recording this session. And we recorded some of the sessions from last semester. So in the next week, I hope to start our DH at U Ottawa YouTube channel so that you'll be able to look back at these workshops and use them as resources for your research teams. I'm sure that they will be exceptionally helpful. In 2 weeks' time, so February 10th, Wednesday, February 10th, we'll be meeting back on Zoom at 11:30 Eastern for an introduction to ArcGIS story maps with René Duplain. And the description is ArcGIS Story Maps is a user-friendly tool that allows users to combine various media, including text, images, videos, and/or maps to showcase a project. Story Maps is a type of ArcGIS online application and can be set up relatively quickly. So it doesn't require extensive GIS knowledge. So if you haven't registered, please go to dhsite.org and register to join us. And we'll look forward to seeing you then. And I believe we've answered all the questions. So thank you very much, Patrick. I really appreciate you joining us again, and we'll see everyone in 2 weeks. Have a great week.